The second Saturday of April comes early in Pettis County, Missouri. By 7 in the morning, the roads leading into Sedalia are already thick with pickup trucks pulling cattle trailers, the kind of slow-moving procession that only happens twice a year when the livestock auction draws farmers from 3 counties. The air smells like turned earth and diesel, and something older than both. Spring in the Missouri Ozarks has a particular quality to it, a heaviness that sits in the chest like the first breath after a long winter, like a man remembering he is still alive. Roy Callahan left his farm at 6:15. He did not eat breakfast. He had not slept well. He had lain in the dark next to his wife Willa and stared at the ceiling for most of the night, running numbers in his head, the way a man does when the numbers matter more than sleep. He was 47 years old that morning. 47 is not young, and it is not old. It is the age when a man knows exactly what he has and exactly what he stands to lose. Roy knew. He had been counting it for 2 years. The farm was 200 acres of Pettis County bottomland land, good soil, well-drained, the kind of land his father had broken his back to buy in 1931, when land was cheap because everything else had already been taken. The Callahan farm had survived the Depression and 2 droughts and one very bad winter in 1951 that killed 11 of the herd. It had survived because Roy's father was the kind of man who did not panic and did not borrow more than he could repay and did not make decisions in the heat of the moment. Roy Callahan had inherited that quality. Most people mistook it for slowness. It was not slowness. It was something else entirely. He drove with the windows up even though the morning was mild. In the trailer behind him, nothing rattled. He was not hauling anything to sell. He was driving to buy, and he had not told Willa what he intended to buy, and he had not told her about the $600 he had been setting aside for 23 months in a coffee can behind the spare belts in the equipment shed. He had not lied to her, not exactly. When Willa had asked over coffee that morning where he was going, he had said the auction. She had asked if he was selling the Maples heifer. He had said no. She had asked what he was going to buy. He had said he was not sure yet. That last part was a lie. He had known exactly what he was going to try to buy for 4 months. He had known it since December when he had read Henri's most recent letter for the 9th time and finally decided that the information was good enough to act on. Roy Callahan was not a gambling man. He needed to be clear about that because the events of that day would make him look like one, and he was not. A gambling man makes decisions based on hope. Roy Callahan made decisions based on information. The difference between those two things is the difference between a fool and a visionary, and the problem is that from the outside on the day of the decision, they look exactly the same. He pulled into the auction barn parking lot at 7:40 and sat in his truck for a few minutes before going in. The barn was already half full. Men in work jackets and feed store caps moved between the pens, looking at the morning's offerings, talking in that low, unhurried way that farmers talk when they are pretending to be less interested than they are. The smell inside was the permanent smell of auction barns everywhere, hay and manure and coffee from the urn by the door, and underneath it all, the particular animal smell of cattle in close quarters. Roy had been coming to this barn since he was 9 years old. He knew the smell the way he knew his own hands. He found a seat in the back, away from the main crowd, away from the men he had grown up with and sold cattle beside for 20 years. He watched. That was the thing about Roy Callahan that most people in Pettis County never understood. He was extraordinarily good at watching, at sitting still and observing and filing away what he saw. Most men at an auction are performing. They are demonstrating their knowledge, their experience, their eye for cattle. Roy had no interest in demonstrating anything. He was there to learn. The lots came through in order. Hereford bulls with thick necks and the deep red color that Missouri farmers had trusted for 3 generations. Black Angus pairs, heavy cows with calves at heel. A few dairy animals that drew scattered interest. Roy watched the bidding patterns. He watched which buyers leaned forward when certain lots came through. He watched the auctioneer, a man named Dewey Pratt, who had been running the Sedalia sale for 15 years and knew every trick in the business. The prices were consistent with what Roy expected. Most bulls were moving between $300 and $500. The premium animals, the ones with documented bloodlines and proven offspring data, were touching $800. One exceptional Hereford bull from a registered operation down near Warrensburg brought $950 and caused a ripple of murmured appreciation through the crowd. Then Lot 47 came into the ring. Roy had been waiting for it since he sat down. He had checked the catalog 3 times before the sale started. Lot 47, young bull approximately 18 months. Breed listed as Charolais. He had almost missed the listing the first time because the spelling was wrong in the catalog, handwritten by someone who had never seen the word before and was guessing at the letters. The animal was unlike anything else that had sold that morning. Where the Herefords were red and white and solid, this bull was pale cream, almost white with a faint pink cast to the skin beneath the sparse hair. Where the Angus bulls were thick and blocky, this animal was lean, almost angular, with a long body and a narrow, refined head. His ribs showed beneath the pale hide. His hip bones jutted at sharp angles. He walked into the ring with a kind of calm indifference to the crowd, like an animal that did not understand why everyone was staring. Dewey Pratt's voice dropped slightly, just a fraction, just enough for anyone who had listened to him for 15 years to notice. Lot 47, gentlemen. Young bull approximately 18 months. Breed listed as Charolais. That is a French breed. For those not familiar, we will start the bidding at $100. Silence. $100, gentlemen. Breeding age bull. Let us see some hands. Nothing moved in the barn. Not a hand, not a program, not a nod. All right, $50. Who will give me 50? Roy raised his hand. 50 from the gentleman in back. Do I hear 60? Silence again. A farmer in the third row turned around to look at who had bid. His expression moved through confusion and arrived at something close to pity. Roy Callahan sat still and waited. 60? Anyone going once at 50? Roy raised his hand again. 75. Dewey Pratt paused. He had been running sales for 15 years. He had seen many things. He had not seen this. Sir, you are bidding against yourself. Roy looked at the auctioneer steadily. I know. 75. The barn went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. A few seconds ago, the quiet was indifference. Now it was attention. People turned in their seats. Men who had been talking to their neighbors stopped talking. Something was happening at the back of the barn, something strange enough to watch. Roy could feel the attention like a physical thing. He did not shift in his seat. He did not look away from the ring where the pale bull stood with his quiet animal patience. $75. Going once. That was when Grover Marsh stood up. You need to understand Grover Marsh before you can understand what happened next. Not just what kind of man he was, but what kind of position he occupied in a place like Sedalia in 1971. Because that position matters. It matters more than the man himself in some ways. Grover Marsh had inherited the John Deere dealership on the west side of Sedalia from his father-in-law 14 years earlier. He had not earned it, which is not necessarily a condemnation, but it is a relevant fact. He had married into it, and then over the following decade and a half, he had worked hard enough to justify the inheritance, and he had built the business into something solid and respectable and profitable. He knew tractors. He genuinely knew them. That part was real. But Grover Marsh had also grown up on a cattle farm in Johnson County, and he had left that life for the dealership, and the leaving had not erased his certainty about cattle. If anything, it had calcified it. He no longer had to test his opinions against the daily reality of running a herd. His opinions about cattle had become permanent and unexamined, like furniture that never gets moved, gathering dust in corners. No one checks anymore. He was a large man, the kind of large that comes from 20 years of good eating and desk work after a boyhood of physical labor. He had a loud voice and a quick laugh and an opinion on every subject that came up, delivered with the confidence of a man who has never been seriously wrong in front of an audience and therefore believes he never will be. The truth is that Grover Marsh was not cruel. That is important to understand. He was not malicious in any deep way. He was something more common and in some ways more dangerous. He was a man who had discovered that making people laugh was the easiest way to maintain status in a room, and he had been doing it for so long that he no longer distinguished between a good joke and a harmful one. He just looked for the opportunity and took it. Roy Callahan, sitting alone in the back row, bidding $75 for a sick-looking pale bull against no competition whatsoever, was the clearest opportunity Grover Marsh had seen all morning. He stood up from his seat in the middle of the barn and turned to face the crowd, which is a particular kind of performance, the move of a man who wants to make sure everyone sees him before he speaks. $75 for that animal, Roy. His voice carried easily through the barn. He had a voice built for carrying. You had better dig that grave now while the ground is sod. That thing will not see July. The barn erupted, not just polite laughter. The full-throated laughter of 200 men who have been standing in a barn since early morning, watching unremarkable lots sell at predictable prices, suddenly given something genuinely funny to look at. The laughter rolled through the barn like a wave hitting a shore. Grover Marsh was not finished. He never finished when the crowd was with him. That was the rule he had learned, the one that kept you at the center of things. Tell you what, Roy, I will sell you a shovel at dealer cost. You are going to need something to dig with. That bull has got one foot in the grave and the other one on a banana peel. More laughter, louder, men nudging each other. Someone in the front row slapped his knee. Clifton Ward, the banker from First National, joined in from his seat near the aisle. Ward had never warmed to Roy Callahan. Too independent, too reluctant to take on debt. The kind of farmer who makes a banker feel slightly irrelevant. Roy, you want to light $75 on fire, Ward called out. At least you would get some warmth out of it. That animal right there is nothing but vet bills and a burial. Vern Stuckey, Roy's nearest neighbor, who had known Roy Callahan since they were both in grade school and should have known better, stood up from his seat 3 rows from the front. Maybe it gives milk, Vern shouted. Skinny like that, maybe it is a dairy operation. Someone else called out from the far side of the barn. French breed. Maybe Roy wants to make some fancy cheese. Roy Callahan sat in the back row and said nothing. He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not smile in the way of a man who is pretending the laughter does not bother him. He simply sat with the particular stillness that had always distinguished him from other men, the stillness of a man who has decided something and no longer needs the room's permission for it. But the last voice was Grover Marsh again, louder than before because the crowd was with him, and a crowd makes a man reach for something bigger. Roy, your daddy built this farm in 30 years. You just buried it in 30 seconds. The laughter that followed that line was the biggest of all. It was the line that landed, the one that cut deepest, not because it was the funniest, but because it was the most specific. It named something real. Roy Callahan's father. The farm. 30 years of work. All of it held up against $75 and a pale bull that looked like it was already dying. Roy Callahan walked to the clerk's window and paid his $75. He loaded Blank into the trailer without help. The bull walked up the ramp with that same calm indifference he had shown in the ring, like an animal that had already accepted whatever was coming next. As Roy pulled out of the parking lot, he could still hear Grover Marsh's voice through the closed windows of his truck. That voice was built to carry. Dead by July. You heard it here first, boys. Roy drove west on Route 50 toward home and did not look in the rearview mirror. This is the part of the story where most people would want to know what Roy was thinking. They would want to know if he was angry or hurt or shaken, if the laughter had found the crack in his certainty and worked its way in. They would want to know if he had a moment of doubt. He did. And to understand that doubt, you have to go back 3 years to a letter from France. Roy Callahan had a cousin named Henri Fontaine. Henri's mother was Roy's mother's older sister, a woman named Frances, who had married a French agricultural worker after the war and moved to a village in Burgundy that Roy had never been able to pronounce correctly. Roy had never met Henri in person. They had exchanged letters occasionally over the years, in the way of distant relatives who share blood and very little else, short letters at Christmas, brief updates about harvests and weather, and the mundane machinery of lives lived far apart. Then, in October of 1968, Henri wrote a letter that was different. Henri worked for a livestock cooperative in Burgundy. He was not a farmer himself, but he moved among farmers, helped it manage breeding programs, understood the economics of cattle in a way that was more analytical than instinctive. He had been watching something develop in the French cattle industry that he thought Roy should know about. The letter was 4 pages handwritten in Henri's careful English, and it described a breed of cattle that had been raised in France for centuries, primarily in the Charolais region of Burgundy, that was beginning to attract serious attention in North America. Roy read that letter at the kitchen table the evening it arrived while Willa was doing the dishes and the radio was on low. He read it once and then he read it again. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his work jacket and carried it there for 3 weeks before he brought it out again. What Henri described was this. The Charolais breed was fundamentally different from the American cattle Roy had grown up with. They were leaner, longer-bodied, lighter in color. To someone who had spent his whole life looking at Herefords and Angus, a Charolais bull in peak condition might look underdeveloped, even sick. The breed standard that American cattlemen had spent generations selecting for the thick, blocky frame and the heavy marbling and the deep color was almost the opposite of what Charolais genetics produced. But the economics of beef production were changing. The American consumer in 1968 was beginning to move slowly, and not yet dramatically, away from heavily marbled beef and toward leaner cuts. The packing houses were beginning to pay attention to carcass yield, the percentage of sellable beef per pound of live weight. A Charolais cross, Henri wrote, could produce a carcass with significantly less waste than a comparable Hereford, reaching market weight faster on less feed. The math over a herd of any size was considerable. There is something else, Henri wrote. The breed is still rare in North America. Only a few thousand animals exist in the entire country, mostly in Canada and Texas, and the bloodlines are tightly controlled. A registered Charolais bull with documented genetics can sell for $5,000, sometimes more. In 10 years, perhaps 15, this breed will be everywhere. They will crossbreed them with Herefords and Angus to improve the entire American beef herd, and the men who control the genetics now will be positioned ahead of everyone else. Watch for Charolais at your local auctions. Most American cattlemen will not recognize them yet. They will see a pale, lean animal and assume it is sick or stunted. If you can find one at a low price before the market understands what it is looking at, you could be sitting on the beginning of something significant. Roy had written back immediately asking for more detail. Henri's second letter came in December of 1968, his third in March of 1969. Roy had written to the American International Charolais Association in Kansas City and received a packet of information that confirmed everything Henri had described. He had read every article in the livestock journals he could find on the breed. He had driven to see a veterinarian in Colombia who had examined Charolais cattle in Canada and could speak to their health profile in a North American climate. Everything checked out. The breed was real, the genetics were sound, the economics made sense, and Henri was right that American cattlemen were still largely unaware of what they were looking at. Roy had started saving the money in the spring of 1969, but there was one thing in Henri's letters that Roy had never shared with anyone, not with Willa, not with anyone. It was a paragraph near the end of Henri's second letter, buried between descriptions of breeding protocols and carcass yield data. Roy had read it so many times he could have recited it from memory. I must be honest with you, Roy. I believe in this breed. I believe the economics are sound and the opportunity is real. But belief is not certainty. The breed has not been proven at scale in American conditions. The climate is different. The disease profile is different. The feed is different. There are unknowns I cannot account for from here. I think you are right to consider this seriously. I also think you should know that you may be right and still lose everything if the conditions are not what we believe they are. Roy had read that paragraph and thought about it for a long time, and then he had continued saving the money. That is the thing that separates Roy Callahan from a gambling man. He had read the warning, he had understood it, he had not looked away from it or told himself it did not apply or convinced himself that Henri was being overly cautious. He had read it clearly and honestly, and then he had made his decision with that warning fully present in his mind. He was not certain, he was informed. The difference between those two things is everything. He drove home from the auction in silence and pulled the trailer around to the back pasture and led Blanc down the ramp into the pen Roy had prepared 3 weeks earlier. The bull walked into the pen and put his head down and began cropping at the grass with the same quiet efficiency he had shown in the auction ring. Roy stood at the fence and looked at him for a long time. Blanc was 18 months old, which meant he was young enough to be unproven and old enough to begin breeding within the year. He was lean in the way that all young Charolais bulls are lean before they mature, a leanness that reads as sickness to anyone who does not know the breed. His color was cream shading toward white, unusual enough in a field of red and white Herefords that he looked almost translucent by comparison. Roy had named him in the truck on the way home. Blanc, the French word for white. It was the most obvious name and also the most honest one. He heard the screen door behind him. Willa walked across the yard and stood beside him at the fence. She looked at the bull for a long moment without speaking. She was a practical woman, Willa Callahan. Not ungenerous, not unkind, but clear-eyed in the way of women who have spent 20 years managing a farm household on a budget that does not forgive carelessness. She saw the animal in the pen. She processed what she saw. She made no effort to hide her assessment. What kind of animal is that? It was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement that is shaped like a question because the speaker already knows more than they are saying. French breed. Charolais. He is going to fill out once he matures. He looks sick, Roy. He is not sick. He is just different from our other cattle. Willa looked at the bull for another moment. How much? $75. She turned and looked at her husband then. Not at the bull, at Roy. That could have been toward the new kitchen range. Could have been. She did not raise her voice. Willa Callahan never raised her voice. She had other ways of making a point. She looked at him for a moment longer with an expression that Roy had learned over 20 years to read carefully. It was the expression of a woman who knows she is not being told everything but has decided for reasons of her own not to push. Not yet. She turned and walked back to the house. The screen door closed behind her. Roy stood alone at the fence. The afternoon light was coming in low and golden over the pasture, and Blanc was grazing in it with his pale coat catching the light in a way that made him look almost radiant against the dark Missouri soil. Roy thought about the $60 still sitting in the coffee can and the equipment shed the remainder of the $600 he had saved. He thought about Henri's letter. He thought about Grover Marsh's voice carrying through the closed windows of his truck. And then for the first time since he had begun saving that money standing at the fence with no one watching, Roy Callahan allowed himself to ask the question he had been holding at arm's length for 2 years. What if Henri is wrong? Not wrong about the breed. Henri was not wrong about the breed. Roy had done enough research to know that, but wrong about the timing, wrong about the American market, wrong about whether the conditions in Missouri would cooperate, wrong in the particular way that intelligent, well-informed people are sometimes wrong, not through ignorance, but through the unpredictability of things that cannot be controlled. Roy stood at that fence for a long time. The sun moved, the shadows lengthened. Blank grazed his way across the pen with slow, patient efficiency. Roy thought about his father, about the farm built in 30 years of incremental, careful work, about the 200 acres of Pettis County bottomland that had survived the Depression because his father made decisions slowly and never bet more than he could afford to lose. Then Roy thought about something else his father had told him once, sitting on the porch in the summer, when Roy was maybe 14 years old. They had been watching a neighbor's farm go up for sale, a good farm run, by a careful man who had simply been overtaken by conditions he could not have predicted. His father had said something then that Roy had not fully understood at the time, but had been turning over in his mind ever since. The men who never take a risk, his father said, think they are being careful. Sometimes they are. And sometimes they are just slowly losing to the men who did their homework. Roy looked at the bull grazing in the last of the afternoon light. He had done his homework. He turned away from the fence and walked back toward the house. The equipment shed was on the way. He stopped inside, reached behind the spare belts, and took the coffee can down from the shelf. He counted what remained, $63. He put the lid back on the can and put it back in its place. He would need that money soon. Doc Hester would need to come out and examine the bull before Roy could begin planning the breeding program. There would be feed costs, pen modifications, the paperwork for the Breed Association registry. The $75 was already spent. The work was just beginning. He washed his hands at the barn sink and went inside for supper. Willa had made pot roast. She set it on the table and sat down across from him and poured the coffee and said nothing about the bull and nothing about the money. They ate in the particular silence of two people who have been married long enough to know when the other one needs to be left alone with something. Outside in the pasture behind the house, a pale cream-colored bull cropped the new spring grass in the long Missouri dusk. No one driving past the Callahan farm that evening would have looked twice at him. That was precisely the point. The spring of 1972 came in cold and stayed cold longer than anyone expected. Roy Callahan spent the first weeks of March doing what he had been doing all winter, which was watching Blanc and keeping records and saying nothing to anyone about what he was observing. The bull had begun to fill out through the fall, and into the cold months the lean, angular frame of the young animal starting to take on mass in the shoulders and through the hindquarters in a way that Roy found quietly satisfying. He was not yet the bull he would become, but the architecture was there visible to anyone who knew how to look at a young animal and see what it was building toward rather than what it currently was. Roy knew how to look at cattle. He had been doing it since he was old enough to see over a fence rail. He had also been doing math. The Callahan farm ran 40 head of registered Hereford cows. If he wanted to begin a serious Charolais crossbreeding program, he needed to expand the cow base before Blank was old enough to cover them. He needed better pen infrastructure, a separate breeding pasture with reliable fencing, a dedicated chute system for the kind of careful documentation that registered crossbreeding required. He had run the numbers in the farm ledger every evening for 3 months. The figures were clear, and they were not encouraging. He needed capital. Not a great deal of it by the standards of larger operations, but more than the Callahan farm could generate in a single season from its existing herd. On a Wednesday morning in early March, Roy put on his good jacket and drove into Sedalia. First National Bank occupied a 2-story brick building on Ohio Street that had been there since Roy was a boy. Clifton Ward had been the branch manager for 11 years, long enough to know every farmer in the county by name and credit history and general disposition toward risk. Ward was not a bad man. He was a careful man, which in a banker is usually an asset and occasionally something else. Roy sat across from Ward's desk and laid out what he needed. He explained the Charolais breed, the crossbreeding program, the economics of carcass yield, and feed conversion. He had brought Henry's letters, the material from the Breed Association, the articles from the livestock journals. He set them on the desk between himself and Ward and let them speak. Ward listened. He was a good listener in the way that cautious men often are. He picked up one of the journal articles and read the first paragraph. He looked at the photograph of a Charolais bull that accompanied it. He set it back down. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at Roy with the expression of a man who has already made his decision, but is searching for the most diplomatic way to deliver it. "I appreciate you putting this together, Roy. You clearly have thought about it." Roy waited. "The problem is that what you are describing is speculative. You are asking me to lend money against a French experiment with one bull that nobody in this county has ever heard of. I cannot take that to the loan committee." Roy looked at him steadily. "The breed is documented," he said. "The economics are real. The association has numbers going back 15 years. Ward nodded slowly in the way that men nod when they are not actually agreeing with you. "Maybe so, but I need collateral I can put a value on. That bull out there, there is no market for him in Pettis County. Nobody would buy him at auction. You proved that yourself last spring." Roy picked up his papers from Ward's desk and put them back in the envelope he had brought them in. He stood up and put on his jacket and thanked Clifton Ward for his time in a voice that gave nothing away. He drove home in silence. For 3 days, he did not go near the ledger. He worked his regular chores, fed and watered the herd, checked the fence line along the east pasture where the winter had loosened 2 of the posts. He ate his meals and helped Willa with whatever needed doing and said nothing about the meeting at the bank. On the 4th day, he went out to the Hereford pasture and stood at the fence for a long time looking at his cattle. Among the 40 head, there were 2 animals that stood apart from the rest. A pair of registered Hereford cows that his father had purchased in 1958 from a premium operation in Platte County. They had documented bloodlines going back 4 generations. They had produced consistently excellent calves. They were the best animals on the Callahan farm and had been for 14 years the foundation of whatever genetic progress the herd had made since Roy's father first brought them home in the bed of a borrowed truck. Roy had a buyer for them within a week, a rancher from Cooper County who had been asking about those 2 cows for 3 years. The price was fair and reflected what they actually were, which was exceptional animals. Roy loaded them into the trailer himself on a Saturday morning before Willa was awake. He did not tell her what he was selling or why. He said he had a delivery to make. When he came back that afternoon, the trailer was empty, and his pocket held enough money to begin the first phase of the breeding program expansion. He put the truck in the equipment shed and sat in the cab for a while before going in. His father had bought those cows when Roy was in his early 30s. He had let Roy help select them, walking the pens at the Platte County sale with a kind of deliberate care that Roy had tried to emulate his whole life. His father had said when they loaded the 2 cows into the trailer that day These animals are an investment in who this farm is going to be. Roy sat in the truck cab and let that memory sit with him without trying to move it along. Then he got out and went in for supper. This is the cost that no one talks about when they tell stories about men who see what others cannot see and hold on long enough to be proved right. The visible cost is the mockery, the laughter, the social friction of being the man in the back row who bids against himself. That part is uncomfortable, but it is external. It moves across the surface of a man and leaves marks but not wounds. The real cost is internal, and it is paid in private. It is paid in a kitchen where a man does not say what he sold that morning and why. It is paid at a fence rail where an animal grazes that used to stand for something a father built. It is paid in the particular silence that grows between two people who love each other when one of them is carrying something too heavy to set down and too uncertain to share. Willa Callahan knew her husband well enough to know something had changed. She did not know what. She did not push. She had her own understanding of the farm and its finances, and she could see the numbers the same as Roy could. She was not a woman who required a full accounting of every decision, but she was also not a woman who missed things. The summer of 1972 passed in the hard, ordinary work of farming. Roy built out the new pen system himself, working in the evenings after the main chores were done. He filed the paperwork with the American International Charolais Association to register Blanc in the breed database, documenting his lineage from the French imports that Henri had helped trace. The process was slow and bureaucratic and required more correspondence than Roy had expected, but he worked through it methodically the same way he worked through every problem that responded to patience. Blanc was now 2 years old, and by every measure Roy could apply, the animal was developing exactly as Henri had predicted. His frame had continued to fill out through the spring and summer. He was not a massive bull in the way of a mature Hereford, but he had a kind of muscular efficiency that Roy found more compelling than sheer size. Long through the body, deep through the chest with hindquarters that reflected the breed's particular gift for producing lean muscle mass rather than fat cover. Doc Hester came out in July for the annual herd examination and spent extra time with Blanc working through a systematic evaluation with the careful attention of a man who recognizes something unusual when he encounters it. He finished his examination and stood back and looked at the bull for a long moment. "You know what you have got here," Doc Hester said. "I think so," Roy said. "Most people who saw this animal at that auction last spring would have walked past him." "I know, they told me." Doc Hester picked up his bag and looked at Roy with an expression that mixed professional admiration with something more personal. "Keep him away from the other bulls during breeding season. And keep him healthy. Whatever you are building here, it starts with this animal staying alive and sound for the next 8 years." Roy nodded. Doc Hester paused at the gate. "I would not mention any of this around town, just yet if I were you." Roy almost smiled. "That is the plan." Then July turned to August, and August into the dry heat of a Missouri late summer, and one morning Roy went out to feed Blanc and found the bull standing at the far corner of the pen with his head down and his breathing wrong. Wrong in the way that anyone who has kept cattle long enough recognizes immediately. Not the deep, slow breathing of a resting animal. Something shallower and more effortful. Something that made Roy move across the pen quickly and put his hand against the bull's neck and feel the heat radiating through the pale hide. He called Doc Hester from the house. The diagnosis was respiratory infection, the kind that moves through cattle in late summer when the heat stress has already compromised their immune response. In a healthy, mature animal, it was manageable. In a young bull who had already been under the physical demand of his first partial breeding season, it was more serious. Doc Hester worked through the afternoon administering what he could, explaining what he was seeing, being honest about what he could not predict. "I have done what I can do tonight," he said before he left. "The next 48 hours will tell you something." Roy sat with Blanc that night. He brought a lantern out to the pen and sat on an overturned feed bucket in the corner and watched the bull breathe in the yellow light. Blanc lay on his side in the straw, his pale flanks rising and falling with a labored rhythm that Roy measured unconsciously, the way you measure something when you are afraid to look away from it. This is the part of the story that happened with no audience and left no record. There were no witnesses to it, and Roy Callahan would never describe it to anyone in detail. But it happened, and it matters because what happened in that pen on that August night is the truest picture of what it costs to be the kind of man Roy Callahan was. He sat in the lantern light and let himself think the things he had been disciplined enough to keep at a distance for more than a year. He thought about the two Hereford cows his father had selected in Platte County in 1958, gone now on a farm in Cooper County, producing calves for another man's herd. Gone for money that had paid for pen infrastructure and breed association paperwork and a breeding program that was currently lying in the straw trying to breathe. He thought about Clifton Ward sitting behind his desk on Ohio Street saying, "I cannot take that to the loan committee." He thought about Grover Marsh's voice carrying through the closed windows of his truck. "Your daddy built this farm in 30 years. You just buried it in 30 seconds." He thought about Henri's letter, the paragraph he had never shown to anyone. "Belief is not certainty, Roy. You may be right and still lose everything." Blanc's breathing was shallow and fast, and the heat coming off him was considerable. Roy sat on his feed bucket and did not move. In 47 years, he had not been a man given to negotiating with things he could not control. He did not bargain with weather or markets or the biological facts of cattle health. He observed, he planned, he acted where action was possible, and he accepted what he could not change with the same stillness he applied to everything else. But in the lantern light in the pen with the Blanc, something in that composure came close to its edge. Not panic. Roy Callahan did not panic, but something near to despair, which is different from panic in that it is quieter and more considered and in some ways harder to recover from. Despair is what happens when a man has thought his way through every available option and found none of them sufficient. It is the feeling that arrives when patience itself runs out of road. Roy sat with it. He did not try to move it along. He let it be there in the lantern light with him and the sick bull and the Missouri night pressing against the walls of the pen. Sometime around 3 in the morning, Blanc shifted in the straw. His breathing changed. Not dramatically, not in the way of a sudden recovery, but the labored quality of it eased slightly. Roy leaned forward on his bucket. The bull's flank rose and fell with a rhythm that was still too fast but was no longer frightening in the same way it had been at midnight. By first light, Blanc was on his feet. Roy stood up from the feed bucket, and his knees ached from the hours of sitting, and his back was stiff, and the lantern had burned down to almost nothing. He put his hand on the bull's neck. The heat was still there, but diminished. The breathing was slow enough to watch without fear. Roy turned off the lantern and walked across the pen and out the gate. He walked to the house and washed his hands at the kitchen sink. He heard Willa moving upstairs, the familiar sounds of a woman beginning her morning. He put the coffee on and sat down at the kitchen table and waited for it to be ready. When Willa came downstairs, she looked at him once and understood that something had happened in the night. She did not ask what. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat down across the table, and they drank their coffee in the early morning quiet while the farm came back to life around them. Roy said nothing about the night in the pen. He said nothing about the fever or the breathing or the hours on the feed bucket. He drank his coffee and got up and went back out to check on Blanc and begin the morning chores. Willa sat at the table for a moment after he left. She looked at the window and the brightening sky beyond it. Then she got up and started breakfast. Doc Hester came back out 2 days later and examined the bull and said the infection had broken and the recovery looked complete. He said it with the particular relief of a veterinarian who had not been entirely certain about his own prognosis and was glad to be wrong in the favorable direction. "Keep him on reduced work for another 3 weeks, Doc Hester said. Then he should be ready to resume." Roy thanked him. He paid the bill from the farm account with a comment. The summer finished and the fall came on with the particular urgency of Missouri autumns, the light-changing quality and the air losing its weight, and the sorghum turning in the fields along Route 50. Roy had bred Blanc to 6 of his best Hereford cows in the spring before the illness, and he watched through the fall as those cows moved into the later stages of their pregnancies with the settled heaviness of animals carrying something that is developing correctly. He told no one which bull had covered which cows. Vern Stuckey stopped his truck at the fence line 3 times between September and November, the way Vern had been stopping since the auction, with the casual cruelty of a man who has decided your misfortune is entertaining enough to monitor regularly. "Still alive," I see Vern called out in September. "You are past Grover's deadline." He said July. Roy was working the fence line and did not look up. In October, Vern pulled over again. "Those cows of yours look heavy. "Whose bull did you use?" Roy's hands kept moving on the wire. He said nothing. Vern pulled away, shaking his head, which Roy saw and noted, and filed away without expression. The calves began arriving in January and February of 1974. They did not look like anything the Callahan farm had produced before. Instead of the deep red and white of the Hereford calves Roy's farm had been producing for 20 years, these calves came out pale. Some were cream-colored like their father. Some were a washed-out tan that came from the mixing of Charolais white and Hereford red. They were longer in the body than normal Hereford calves. They held their heads differently, with the narrow, refined quality of the Charolais breed. Where newborn Herefords were blocky and compact and quick to get on their feet, with a kind of purposeful solidity, these calves were leaner and longer and moved differently. They were also, Roy observed, exceptionally vigorous. The birth weights were good. The calves were on their feet quickly and nursing strongly, and growing at a rate that Roy charted in the farm ledger with the careful precision he applied to all his records. Vern Stuckey stopped his truck in March. "What in the world happened to your calves?" he said. "They look sick. You got some kind of disease moving through your herd." Roy looked up from what he was doing. "They are fine. They are just a different breed than what you are used to seeing. They do not look fine. They look like someone drained the color out of them. You should call Doc Hester. Doc Hester has already seen them." Vern shook his head slowly. "Your funeral, Roy. Those animals will not bring 10 cents at market looking like that." Roy watched Vern drive away. He thought about that phrase, "your funeral." It was the second time in 3 years that someone had used a funeral as a metaphor for his farming decisions. He supposed there was a kind of logic to it. From the outside, what Roy Callahan had been doing since April of 1971 did look like a slow procession toward financial ruin. A $75 purchase that the whole county had witnessed and mocked. 2 years of operating costs on a breeding program that had not yet produced a single dollar of income. A bank that had refused to lend against it. And now a barn full of pale calves that his nearest neighbor had just diagnosed as diseased. From the outside, it looked exactly like what Grover Marsh had said it was. A man burying 30 years of his family's work in 30 seconds of poor judgment. Roy went back to his records. The fall of 1974 arrived with the cool clarity that the Missouri autumn produces after a hot summer, the air sharp and the light lower, and the fields ready for what was coming. Roy spent 2 weeks in September preparing his calves for market, doing the kind of careful pre-sale conditioning that distinguishes a serious producer from a casual one. He documented everything. Birth weights, weaning weights, feed conversion records, sire identification. He had the paperwork that almost no one at the Sedalia auction had ever seen from a small operation. He drove to the sale on a Thursday morning and said nothing to Willa about what he expected. The cattle buyer from Kansas City arrived at the auction barn at 9 and began walking the pens in the unhurried way of a professional who has looked at more animals than he can count and knows within 30 seconds what he is looking at. His name was Fletcher's, and he worked for one of the larger packing operations in the region, and he had been coming to the Sedalia auction for 6 years. Roy watched him move through the pens. He watched Fletcher's pace change when he reached the pen that held Roy's calves. Fletcher stopped. He walked around the pen twice. He opened the gate and walked among the calves, putting his hands on them, checking frames and muscle development. With the practiced efficiency of a man running an assessment he has run thousands of times, he looked at Roy's documentation. He read it with an attention he did not give to most of the paperwork he received at country auctions. Then he looked up at Roy. "These are Charolais crosses, that is right. First ones I have seen at this market." Fletcher walked around the pen one more time. "They are going to dress out differently than what the barn is used to seeing. Leaner carcass, less waste, higher yield percentage. The packers are starting to ask for this specifically. These calves will move easily." He named a price. It was 15% above the market rate for comparable Hereford calves that day. Roy nodded once and they shook hands, and Roy went to settle the paperwork with the barn office. He collected his check and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and walked out to his truck. He sat in the truck for a moment. He did not feel what people might imagine he felt. He did not feel vindicated or triumphant or relieved in the sharp, dramatic way of a man who has been proved right after years of being told he was wrong. What he felt was something quieter than that and more private. He felt the particular satisfaction of a man who did the work correctly and watched the work produce its result. That is not the same as triumph. Triumph has an audience. What Roy felt had no audience at all and needed none. He drove home and stopped at the hardware store on the edge of town. He went inside and looked at kitchen ranges for about 10 minutes and had a conversation with the man at the counter about delivery schedules. He paid a deposit from the check in his jacket pocket. When he got home, Willa was in the kitchen. He set the remaining portion of the check on the counter next to the coffee maker and hung up his jacket and went out to check the evening feeding. Willa picked up the check. She looked at the number on it for a long moment. Then she set it back on the counter and looked out the window at her husband crossing the yard toward the barn. She did not say anything. She did not go to the window and call out to him. She stood in her kitchen and looked at the check and understood without being told what it meant and what it had come and how long it had taken. The new range arrived 2 weeks later. Roy was in the equipment shed when the delivery truck came. He heard it and went to help bring it in. Willa directed the placement with the quiet authority of a woman who has decided exactly where something belongs and does not need to explain it. When the delivery men left, she made coffee on the new range. She set a cup in front of Roy at the kitchen table and sat down across from him. She looked at him with the clear-eyed directness that Roy had always valued more than he could say. The winter of 1974 passed and spring came, and Roy bred Blanc to 12 cows. The following fall, he took a larger group of calves to market, and the result was consistent with what Fletcher had told him. By the spring of 1976, Roy was operating a breeding program that had moved from experiment to enterprise, the distinction being that experiments require faith, while enterprises produce numbers, and Roy's numbers were now producing a logic that required no faith at all. He sold the first Charolais breeding bull in the spring of 1977. The buyer was a rancher from Harvey County, Kansas, a man named Dillard Hewitt, who had been reading about Charolais genetics in the Breed Association journals and had spent 3 months locating sources of documented bloodlines in the Midwest. He had driven over 200 miles to the Callahan farm on a February morning and spent 4 hours looking at the operation before he was satisfied. He walked through the pastures and asked questions about birth weights and feed conversion and bloodline documentation with the focused intelligence of a man making a serious investment. Roy answered everything directly and showed him the records he had kept since 1971. "You have the real thing here," Dillard Hewitt said. "Documented Charolais tracing to original French imports. Do you know how rare that is in this part of the country? I know." Hewitt looked at the bull Roy was offering, a 3-year-old son of Blanc, with the breed's characteristic lean muscle development and the pale cream coloring that had once caused an entire auction barn to burst out laughing. "Where did you get the original, sire? Local auction. What did you pay?" Roy looked at him steadily. $75. Hewitt was quiet for a moment, then he laughed. Not the laughter of the auction barn, something entirely different. The delighted recognition of a man who understands what he is hearing. $75. "And now you are selling his son for $1,200. Seems that way." Hewitt shook his head slowly with an expression that Roy would think about later. It was the expression of a man who has just been shown something he wants to remember. "You are going to be operating a different kind of farm in 10 years, Mr. Callahan." Roy said nothing to that. "I am going to be a cattle farmer, same as always." But the numbers were changing, and Roy knew it, and kept the knowledge the way he kept most things inside, tended to carefully not display to anyone who had not earned the right to see it. By 1978, he had expanded the Charolais program to 30 head. By 1980, he was selling 5 or 6 breeding bulls per year at prices that ranged from $2,000 to $5,000 depending on conformation and bloodline documentation. The buyers came from Kansas, from Nebraska, from Oklahoma. Some had read about Charolais genetics in the national journals. Some had heard about the Callahan operation through the Breed Association networks. Some had simply followed a recommendation from another buyer who had purchased an animal and watched it perform. None of them came from Pettis County. The men of Pettis County were still figuring out what they had missed. Grover Marsh had been figuring it out slowly and unhappily for several years by then. He had watched Roy's operation expand from the comfortable distance of a man who had positioned himself as an expert and found that position increasingly difficult to maintain. He had read the articles in the livestock journals. He had heard the prices that Roy's bulls were bringing. He had done enough arithmetic to understand roughly what the Callahan farm had become in 10 years. He told himself that Roy had gotten lucky. He told himself this with the conviction of a man who needs it to be true. But Grover Marsh had other problems by 1980 that were larger than his pride and more immediate than his wounded certainty about cattle. The farm crisis that had been building across the American Midwest since the mid-1970s was arriving in Pettis County with the particular force of something that has been traveling a long way and has not lost any speed. Interest rates were climbing toward levels that made borrowing for equipment purchases nearly impossible. Commodity prices were falling. Farmers who had taken on debt during the expansion years of the 1970s were finding that debt suddenly unbearable. The John Deere dealership on the west side of Sedalia sold tractors to farmers. Farmers who were going broke did not buy tractors. This was a simple equation, and Grover Marsh was running it in his head every morning when he opened the dealership and looked at the inventory sitting on the lot and calculated what it was costing him per day to keep it there. He had made decisions in the good years that assumed the good years would continue. He had expanded his inventory. He had taken on financing for equipment he expected to sell within the season. He had operated with the confidence of a man who had been right about enough things for long enough that being wrong had ceased to feel like a real possibility. The farm crisis did not care about Grover Marsh's confidence. Roy heard the news about the dealership this way he heard most things in Sedalia, through the ordinary channels of a small town where information moves without being sent. He heard it at the feed store and at the diner, and once in the parking lot of the hardware store, when two men who did not notice him nearby were discussing the details with the slightly guilty pleasure that people take in the troubles of the prominent. He did not comment on what he heard. He did not offer opinions. He drove home and went back to work. The spring of 1982 brought Roy a decision he had been preparing for since he first understood what the breeding program was capable of becoming. He made the decision to sell his entire remaining Hereford herd. Every animal. The last connection to the cattle his father had built the farm around, except for the 2 cows he had already sold in 1972 and whose absence still registered in him like a scar that is healed but not disappeared. He converted the operation entirely to registered Chevrolet. He did not announce this. He did not make a production of it. He placed his Hereford cattle in a sale and sold them well, and reinvested in expanding the Chevrolet cow base. By the end of that year, the Callahan farm carried 60 head of registered Chevrolet females, and Blanc's sons and grandsons had seeded herds across 3 states. Blanc himself was 13 years old and showing it. He had lost the lean angularity of his youth and replaced it with the settled authority of an aged bull who has done what he was put on this earth to do and done it well. Roy had retired him from active breeding 2 years earlier. He grazed in the home pasture in the particular unhurried peace of an old animal with nothing left to prove. Roy spent time at that fence the way he had spent time there in the beginning, watching measuring finding in the animal's presence, something that did not require words. In the late summer of 1984, Blanc died. He died in the night quietly in the home pasture where Roy had put him all those years ago after the auction. Roy found him in the morning lying in the grass in the long light with the calm finality that old animals carry in their deaths. Nothing violent, nothing prolonged. Simply the ending of something that had run its full course. Roy stood at the fence for a while. Then he went in and told Willa. She put down what she was doing and came and stood beside him at the window, and they looked out at the pasture together without speaking. 14 years, Roy said. Good life for a bull. Willa nodded. His bloodline is in 23 bulls on farms across this state, Roy said. 60 registered females tracing back to him in this herd alone. Willa looked at her husband for a moment. Are you all right? Roy considered the question with the same honest attention he gave to everything. Yes, he said, I am all right. He buried Blanc in the far corner of the home pasture, which was not the practical choice but was the right one, and then he went back to work because there was work to do, and the spring breeding sale was 8 months away, and he had 4 bulls to consign that he intended to sell for prices that no one in Pettis County would have believed possible on a second Saturday in April 14 years ago. The second Saturday of April in 1985 came in clear and cold the way the best spring mornings do in Missouri, with a sky so blue it looks painted, and a light that has not yet acquired the weight of summer. Roy Callahan left his farm at 6:15, the same time he had left it 14 years earlier. He drove the same road into Sedalia, past the same fields that were beginning to show the first green of the season, past the same farms that had changed hands and the same ones that had not. He pulled into the auction barn parking lot and sat in his truck for a moment before going in. The catalog on the seat beside him had his name in it 4 times. Lot 23. Registered Chevrolet Bull, 4 years old, sired by Callahan Blanc, the second documented bloodline tracing to original French imports. Suggested opening bid $8,000. He had read those lines so many times in the past week that they had lost their capacity to surprise him. But sitting in the parking lot of the Sedalia auction barn on a cool April morning, he read them one more time. Not because he needed to, because he wanted to sit with what they represented for just a moment before he went inside and it became a transaction. The barn was more crowded than Roy had seen it since the spring sales of the early 1970s. The Charolais market had reached a point that Henri had predicted from his desk in Burgundy 17 years ago, the point at which the breed had moved from curiosity to necessity in the American beef industry. Buyers had driven from Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma. There was a man from Texas who had arrived the previous evening and taken a room at the motel on Route 50. The catalog had been mailed to registered producers across 4 states. Roy found his seat in the back of the barn. The same seat. He had not planned it that way, or perhaps he had in some part of himself that did not require conscious intention. He settled into it and looked out at the crowd filling the rows ahead of him, and recognized most of the faces and noted how the room had changed and how it had not. Clifton Ward was there 3 rows from the front, older now, his hair gone entirely white, sitting with the careful posture of a man who has learned to take up less space than he once did. The bank had worked through the farm crisis better than some and worse than others. Ward had survived it. He had not thrived in it. Vern Stuckey was in the 5th row with his 2 sons, both of them now grown and farming their own parcels of the Stuckey property. Vern had come around on Chevrolet genetics 4 years ago in the way that neighbors eventually come around on things that the market makes undeniable. He had purchased 2 Chevrolet Cross heifers from an operation in Saline County rather than from Roy, which Roy had noted without comment. The lots ahead of Roy's bulls sold at prices that would have been unimaginable in 1971. The Chevrolet market had done exactly what Henri said it would do, and the men in this barn were still catching up to it. Roy watched the bidding with the same quiet attention he had brought to every auction he had attended in his life. He watched which buyers leaned forward and which ones held back. He watched the auctioneer work the room. He watched the patterns that revealed themselves to anyone patient enough to sit still and observe without the distraction of performing their own expertise. He did not see Grover Marsh come in. He became aware of him the way you become aware of a change in air pressure, not through any single sense, but through some combination of them. A shift in the quality of the room's attention, a slight adjustment in the behavior of the men near the entrance. Roy turned and looked toward the door. Grover Marsh stood just inside the entrance of the barn. The man Roy saw was not the man who had stood up in this same barn 14 years ago and turned to face the crowd with the confidence of someone who has never had a reason to doubt himself in public. That man had been large and loud and had filled whatever space he occupied as a matter of course, the way that certain men do when the world has consistently confirmed their importance. This man was thinner. The largeness was gone, not just the physical weight of it, but the structural quality that weight had supported the sense of a man who takes up space because he has earned the right to. Grover Marsh's shoulders were forward and his head was slightly down, and he stood at the entrance of the auction barn with the careful stillness of a man who is not certain whether he has the right to somewhere. He stood there for a long time. Roy watched him without moving. The dealership had closed in the spring of 1984. Roy had heard the details in the way he heard most things gradually and from multiple directions. The inventory financing that Grover had taken on during the expansion years had become unsustainable when the sales volume collapsed. The bank had worked with him longer than they might have worked with a less prominent borrower. In the end, it had not mattered. 20 years of the Marsh name on the John Deere sign on the west side of Sedalia, and then the sign came down and the lot sat empty, and Grover Marsh was 60 years old with a business that no longer existed. Roy had thought about that number. 60 years old. He knew what 60 felt like from the inside. It was not old in the way that 20 imagines old to be, but it was the age at which a man can count more clearly than he could before, can see the shape of what he has built and what he has not built, and understand that certain things are no longer recoverable. Grover finally moved away from the entrance and made his way through the crowd. Roy watched him navigate the rows, watched men notice him and look away, Watch the particular social discomfort that surrounds a person whose public reversal is recent enough that no one has yet settled on how to behave around him. Grover stopped at the row where Roy was sitting. Their eyes met. Roy did not look away and did not shift in his seat and did not make any of the small social adjustments that would have given Grover permission to pass by without stopping. He simply held the other man's gaze with the steadiness that had always been his particular quality. Grover moved into the row and sat down in the seat beside Roy. For a moment, neither man spoke. The auction moved forward in front of them, the auctioneer's voice working the room paddles rising and falling, prices climbing in the unhurried rhythm of a well-run sale. Been a while, Grover said. 14 years. That is right. Grover looked at the ring. 14 years. He was quiet for a moment. Roy let the silence sit. I see your bulls are selling today. 4 of them. What are you expecting to get, Roy considered the question. Depends on the bidding. 15,000 for the best one. Maybe more. Grover nodded slowly. He was looking at the sale ring, but Roy understood he was not seeing it. And the bull you bought in 71, the one I said would not last the summer. Blanc, he died last year, 14 years old. Good life for a bull. Roy let a moment pass. His bloodline is in 4 bulls selling today. 23 of his grandsons are on farms across Missouri. 60 head of registered Charolais in my breeding program trace back to him. All from a $75 purchase. That is right. Grover was quiet again. The kind of quiet that a man falls into when he is working through something that does not resolve easily. Roy had seen that quality of silence before in other men, and he recognized it for what it was. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. The silence of someone who has been carrying something for a tenured time and is trying to find the words to set it down. When Grover spoke again, his voice was lower than it had been. Pitched for Roy alone, not for the room. I owe you an apology. Roy said nothing. What I said at that auction, what I said about you in front of all those people. I was wrong. I was trying to get a laugh, and I was wrong. You saw something that none of us could see, and I made you a joke for it. For 14 years, I made you a joke for it. And I was wrong. Roy looked at him steadily. You were. I'm sorry, Roy. That is what I came here to say. I am sorry. The auctioneer's voice cut through the moment with the announcement of the next lot. Lot 23, ladies and gentlemen. Registered Charolais bull, 4 years old, sired by Callahan Blanc II. Roy turned to watch his bull enter the ring. The animal that walked out of the holding area into the auction ring was magnificent in the particular way of a Charolais bull in his prime. Cream-colored like his grandfather, but carrying the full development of a mature animal deep through the chest, heavy through the hindquarters, with the long-bodied efficiency of a breed that had been selected for muscle rather than fat for 300 years. He walked into the ring with the unhurried authority of an animal that does not startle and does not perform. The barn went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something worth looking at has entered them. We will open the bidding at $8,000, Dewey Pratt said. Who will give me 8 hands went up immediately. Not the tentative single hand of a man testing the water. Multiple hands from multiple directions from buyers who had driven hundreds of miles specifically for this. 8,000. Who gives me 9? The bidding moved with a speed that was different from anything Roy had seen in this barn before. Not the cautious, incremental progress of men bidding on animals they were uncertain about. The confident escalation of buyers competing for something they understood the value of completely. 10, 11, 12. The Texas buyer in the front row had his paddle up at 12 and did not lower it. 13, 14, $15,000. The voice came from the Texas buyer, delivered with the flat certainty of a man making a statement rather than asking a question. The barn went quiet. $15,000, ladies and gentlemen, going once, going twice. Sold for $15,000. Roy made a small notation in his catalog. He did not smile. He did not look around the room to see who was watching. He looked at the notation he had made, and then he looked at the ring where the handler was leading his bull back to the holding area, and then he turned back to Grover Marsh. Apology accepted, he said. Grover looked at him. Just like that. What else is there? Grover shook his head slowly. After everything I said, after the way I treated you in front of the whole county, that was 14 years ago, Roy said. We have both gotten older. He paused. I expect we have both gotten wiser. Grover was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about that day for 14 years, running it back in my mind, trying to figure out how you knew, how you saw what none of us could see. I had help. Roy said it plainly without false modesty and without embellishment. A letter from my cousin Henri. He worked in the cattle industry in France. He told me about Charolais, told me what they were going to be worth, told me to watch for them at auctions because most American cattlemen would not recognize them. A letter. A letter and the willingness to do the research. The knowledge was there for anyone who looked for it. The breed associations were publishing. The livestock journals were covering it. The information existed. I just went looking for it. Grover sat with that for a moment. I did not look, he said. I already knew everything. Roy looked at him once directly and then turned back to the ring as his second bull was announced. That is right, Roy said quietly. You already knew everything. The second bull sold for $13,000, the third for 11, the fourth for 12. Roy made his notations in the catalog with the same economy of movement he applied to everything. $51,000 in a single afternoon from 4 animals descended from a bull that had cost $75 and been declared dead by July by the loudest voice in the barn. As the last of his bulls left the ring, Grover Marsh spoke again. I have lost the dealership. Roy already knew this, but he said nothing. The bank is finishing the process next month. 20 years of my life, and it is gone. Roy waited. I am not asking for sympathy. I made my choices. I spent money I should not have spent, and I bet on conditions I should not have bet on, and I was wrong about that too. Grover paused. I do not know what I am going to do. I am 60 years old. I know tractors and I know cattle, and I do not know much else. He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at Roy. I do not suppose you are hiring. Roy looked at the man beside him. He looked at him with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered, without hurry and without the distortion of strong feeling in either direction. He thought about what Grover had said 14 years ago, the line about his father and 30 years and 30 seconds. He thought about sitting in the dark in the pen with Blank and running that line through his mind in the worst hours of that night. He thought about the 2 Hereford cows his father had selected in Platte County in 1958, now 12 years gone, their absence, a fact that had been absorbed into the permanent record of what this had cost. And then he thought practically. The way Roy Callahan always thought when a decision needed to be made. Grover Marsh knew cattle. Whatever else was true about the man, that was also true. He had grown up on a farm in Johnson County, and he had spent 20 years in the equipment business, and he understood the mechanics of agriculture at a level that most hired hands Roy had worked with did not approach. He understood breeding cycles and equipment, maintenance, and the management of a working operation. Roy needed someone to help run the spring breeding season. He needed someone with enough experience to be trusted with animals that were worth more than most houses in Pettis County. He looked at the man beside him and performed this calculation without sentiment and without the distortion of either resentment or charity. Come out to the farm Monday morning, Roy said. 6 a.m. Grover looked at him. The expression on his face moved through surprise and then something more complicated that Roy did not try to name. After everything I said to you, that was 14 years ago. Roy stood up as the next lot came into the ring. I am not offering you charity, Grover. I need someone to help run the breeding season, and you know enough to be useful. Hard work, early mornings, cattle that do not care what you used to be. He looked at Grover once more. You interested or not? Grover was quiet for a long moment. I am interested. Then I will see you Monday. Do not be late. Roy walked down toward the ring to watch the remaining lots sell. He did not look back. Grover Marsh arrived at the Callahan farm at 5:45 on Monday morning. Roy was already in the barn. He heard the truck in the yard and looked at the clock on the wall and noted the time without comment. When Grover came into the barn, Roy handed him a pair of work gloves and a list of the morning's tasks written in his careful hand and told him to start with the feeding rotation in the east pens. Grover did not ask questions about the tasks. He read the list and went to work. This was the thing that Roy observed in the first week and filed away alongside everything else he observed and filed. Grover Marsh, stripped of the dealership and the status in the 30 years of being the loudest and most certain man in whatever room he entered, was a different kind of worker than the man he had been in that version of his life. He arrived before he was expected. He stayed until the work was finished. He did not offer opinions that had not been solicited. He asked questions when he needed to and was quiet when he did not. There was something driving him. Roy understood what it was without needing it explained. A man of 60 who has lost the thing that defined him for 20 years and who also carries the specific weight of having been loudly and publicly wrong about something that turned out to matter. That man has reasons to work hard that go deeper than wages. Roy taught him about Charolais genetics, the way Roy's father had taught Roy about everything that mattered. Not through lectures, not through demonstrations of superior knowledge. Through quiet example, impatient explanation, and the willingness to let a person make a mistake and then help them understand what had gone wrong, which is the only teaching that actually holds. Grover learned the bloodlines. He learned the breeding records and the documentation protocols that the breed association required. He learned the management of a registered breeding program with the particular focus of a man who understands finally and completely that he does not already know everything. The years move forward in the way that years do on a working farm, not in dramatic events, but in the accumulated weight of seasons, each one building on what came before it. The Callahan operation continued to grow in the quiet, incremental way that Roy had always preferred: more cows, more documented bulls, a reputation that spread through the breed association networks without requiring announcement. Grover became the assistant manager of the operation in 1988. He knew every animal in the herd by then, every bloodline, every buyer across 4 states who might be in the market for a premium Charolais bull. He had become, in the decades since he arrived at the farm at 5:45 on a Monday morning, exactly the student he should have been 20 years earlier when the information was still available to him, and he was still too certain about everything to go looking for it. On an evening in the early 1990s, Roy and Grover sat on the porch after a long day of sorting cattle for the spring sale. The sun was going down over the Callahan pastures, and the herd was settling for the night, and the particular piece of a working farm at the end of a productive day was everywhere around them. Grover was looking at the pasture where the breeding cows moved in the fading light. "You know what I have learned," Grover said, not as a question, as a man working something out in the open for perhaps the first time. Roy waited. "I have learned that the things I was most certain about were the things I understood least." Roy nodded slowly. "That bull in 71. I looked at him for 30 seconds, and I knew he was worthless. I stood up in front of 200 men, and I announced it like it was a fact I had proven. And I was completely and absolutely wrong." Roy said nothing. "Most people make mistakes like that," Grover said. "Everyone is wrong sometimes. But most people are not wrong in front of 200 people on the record." He shook his head. "What I cannot forgive in myself is not the being wrong. It is the being loud about it, making you into a joke when you were the only one who understood what you were looking at." "The past is past," Roy said. "Is it? I remember that day like it happened last month. I can still hear my own voice. I can still see your face. What look, calm, like none of it was touching you, like you already knew something the rest of us were going to spend years figuring out. I thought you were too simple to be embarrassed." Grover paused. "Turns out you were too smart to care." Roy sipped his coffee and looked at the pasture. "Henri told me something in one of his letters," Roy said. "He said that a man who knows something valuable has to make a choice. He can share it, and everyone benefits, but no one owes him anything for it. Or he can be patient and let the truth prove itself, and then the proof belongs to him alone. The price of the second choice is being misunderstood for however long it takes." Grover was quiet for a moment. "You chose to wait. I chose to wait." Roy set his cup down. 14 years is a long time to wait. And now everyone understands. And now everyone understands. Roy looked at the pasture where the last of the light was moving across the grass. "It does not require my help anymore." They sat on the porch until the dark came, and the cattle settled, and the farm went quiet around them, in the way of farms at night, that particular rural quiet that is not the absence of sound, but a different quality of it. Willa brought coffee out at some point and set it on the railing between them, without interrupting whatever was being worked out between the two men in the dark, because Willa Callahan had always known when something needed to be left alone. Roy Callahan died in October of 2003. He was 79 years old. He died the way he had lived, without drama and without announcement, in the farmhouse where he had been born, in the early morning before anyone else was awake. Willa had preceded him by 2 years. He had buried her in the county cemetery on a September afternoon and then come home and gone back to work because there was work to do, and Willa would not have wanted the work to stop for her. He had visited her grave every Sunday morning until the end. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church in Sedalia on a Thursday afternoon. More people came than the church could hold. Roy Callahan had not been a man of public prominence in the way of Pettis County's more visible citizens. He had not sat on the Chamber of Commerce or chaired the Agricultural Board or been quoted in the Sedalia Democrat on matters of local importance. But he had been something else, something that people understood better at the end of a life than at its beginning. He had been the kind of man whose presence in a community is felt most clearly in his absence. Grover Marsh was 79 years old himself by then, white-haired and slower than he had been when he first arrived at the Callahan farm at 5:45 on a Monday morning, but still sharp in the way of men who have spent their later years doing work that demands attention. He had retired from the farm 2 years earlier at Roy's gentle suggestion when the physical demands of the breeding season had become more than his body could reliably meet. He still lived in the county. He still drove out to the farm occasionally to look at the cattle and talk to Meg about the operation. He stood at the front of the church and looked out at the crowd and took a moment before he spoke. "I knew Roy Callahan for 50 years, Grover said. For the first 15 or 16 of those years, I thought he was a quiet man with good land and ordinary prospects. I did not pay him much attention. I was too busy being certain about things." He paused. "In April of 1971, I stood up in the Sedalia auction barn and told everyone I could reach with my voice that Roy Callahan was throwing his money away on a sick bull. I said that animal would not live to see July. I said it loud, and I said it proud, and the whole barn laughed with me." He stopped and looked at his hands for a moment. "That bull lived 14 years. His bloodline is in herds across this country. And Roy Callahan never once in all the years I knew him afterward threw those words back in my face. He had more right to than any man I have ever met, but that was not who Roy was." The church was very quiet. Roy did not need to say anything. Grover continued because the truth was already saying it for him. It was in his pastures and his cattle and the checks he deposited every spring when the bull sold. The truth did not need his help. It just needed time. "He taught me something," Grover said. "Several things. He taught me that the loudest voice in a room is usually the most ignorant one. He taught me that real knowledge is quiet and patient and willing to wait as long as it needs to wait to be proved right. He taught me that when you are wrong, genuinely and completely wrong, the only honorable response is to admit it and change." He paused again. "Roy's father built this farm in 30 years of careful work. I said once in front of 200 people that Roy had buried that work in 30 seconds. I was wrong about that too. Roy did not bury what his father built. He built on it. He turned a $75 purchase that the whole county laughed at into something that will still be producing champions long after everyone in this room is gone. Roy's father built the farm in 30 years. Roy built a legacy in 30 seconds when he raised his hand in the back of that auction barn and said $75 and meant every cent of it." Grover looked out at the crowd one more time. "I spent the last 18 years trying to be more like Roy Callahan. I am still trying. I expect I will spend whatever time I have left still trying. Rest easy, old friend. You earned it." The Callahan farm did not stop when Roy stopped. Meg Callahan was 34 years old when she took over the operation from her father, who had managed it after Roy's retirement in the late 1990s. She was the third generation of Callahan cattle farmers, which is a fact worth sitting with for a moment because it means something about the nature of what Roy had built. Most things that men build in their lifetimes do not survive the generation that follows them. They require the specific combination of knowledge and circumstance and willingness that produce them, and when the man who carried that combination is gone, the thing he built begins to diminish. Roy Callahan had built something different. He had built a system of knowledge and practice that could be transmitted, that could be learned by someone who came after and carried forward without requiring the original man to be present. Meg had grown up with the cattle. She had sat on the fence rail watching Roy work from the time she could walk. She had asked questions and received answers and understood, by the time she was old enough to take it seriously, that what she was inheriting was not just land and animals, but a particular way of thinking about information and patience. and the relationship between what a thing looks like and what it actually is. She ran the operation with the same careful attention her grandfather had brought to it. She kept the records in the same format Roy had developed in the 1970s. She maintained the bloodline documentation with the same precision. She sold bulls at premium prices to buyers who came from across the country because the Callahan name on a registration paper meant something in the breed association networks that Roy had built his reputation in over 30 years. In the office of the barn on the wall beside the breeding records and the framed association certificates, she hung a photograph that had been found in Roy's desk after his death. The photograph showed Blanc as a yearling, taken sometime in 1972 by the look of the light in the season. The bull stood in his home pasture with his pale coat catching the afternoon sun, lean and angular and somewhat underdeveloped in the way of young Charolais bulls, which is to say that he looked to anyone who did not know the breed like an animal that had not thrived. He looked, if you did not know what you were looking at, like exactly what the whole barn had said. He was on a second Saturday in April in 1971. Beside the photograph in a frame of its own hung a letter. The paper was yellowed at the edges and fragile at the folds in the way of documents that have been handled many times over many years. The handwriting was careful and slightly formal, the English of a man for whom it was a second language, but a practiced one. At the top it was dated October 1968, and it began with the words, "There is something happening here that you should know about." Below the photograph and the letter centered on the wall between them was a small brass plaque. Meg's father had commissioned it sometime in the late 1980s, and it had hung in the barn office since before Meg was old enough to read it. The plaque was simple and did not require explanation. Blanc, Charolais bull, born 1970, died 1984, purchased 1971 for $75, value of his descendants beyond calculation. Below that in slightly smaller letters, a second inscription. The things we are most certain about are the things we know least about. Grover Marsh, 1985. Every morning before she began her work, Meg Callahan stood in the office doorway and read that plaque. Not because she needed reminding, not because she had forgotten what it said. She had known those words since she was a child. She read it because she understood, in the way that people who have inherited something real understand the weight of it, that knowing something and remembering it are not the same thing. Knowing is what you carry in your mind. Remembering is what you do every day on purpose to make sure the knowing does not become the particular kind of comfortable certainty that had stood up in the Sedalia auction barn in 1971 and announced to the room that the truth was a sick bull that would not see July. Outside the office in the pastures that Roy Callahan had worked for 50 years, the cattle moved through the Missouri morning with the unhurried efficiency of animals that do not know their own history and do not need to. They were cream-colored and lean and long-bodied in the particular way of their breed, and they were worth considerably more than $75, and they would be worth more still when their sons and grandsons and great-grandsons entered auction rings that Roy Callahan had never seen in front of crowds. He would never know in a country that was still catching up to what he had understood in 1968 when he read a letter from France at his kitchen table while Willa did the dishes and the radio played low. The auction barn in Sedalia still runs its spring sale on the second Saturday of April. The seat in the back row is just a seat now. It does not know what it witnessed. Seats do not know things. Men do or they do not, depending on whether they have learned the difference between what something looks like and what it is, and whether they have been humble enough to go looking for that difference before the room has already decided. Roy Callahan knew the difference. He knew it on a cold April morning in 1971 when he drove 40 miles to an auction with $600 in a coffee can and a letter from France folded in his jacket, and a question he had been honest enough to ask himself and patient enough to answer correctly. He knew it when he sat in silence while the barn laughed. He knew it on a long night in a calf pen with a lantern burning low, and a bull that might have been dying, and a faith that was not certainty, but was something better. A conclusion arrived at through honest work and willingness to be wrong. He knew it when he drove home from a sale with a check that proved the world had finally caught up to what he had seen first, and stopped at a hardware store and paid a deposit on a kitchen range and said nothing to anyone about what any of it meant. And he knew it on a second Saturday in April in 1985, sitting in the same seat in the same barn, when a diminished man sat down beside him and said, "I owe you an apology," And Roy Callahan said, apology accepted just like that because what else was there? The truth had already said everything that needed saying. It had been saying it for 14 years out in the pastures of the Callahan farm, in the pale coats of cattle that did not look like what Missouri thought cattle should look like, in the numbers in a ledger that Roy kept with the same careful hand his father had taught him, in the quiet accumulation of seasons that turned a $75 purchase into something that would outlast everyone who had laughed at it. The truth does not need to be announced. It does not need to stand up in the back of the barn and answer the man in the middle row. It does not need witnesses or validation or the acknowledgement of the room. It just needs to be true and to be worked and to be patient. Roy Callahan understood that. He understood it before most people in Pettis County had heard of a Chevrolet Bull, and he understood it in the year when understanding it cost him things he could not replace, and he understood it at the end when understanding it had become the thing that everyone around him had finally caught up to. That is the whole of it. That is what the plaque says in the barn office on the Callahan farm in Pettis County, Missouri, where the cattle still graze in the morning light, and the records are still kept with the same care they were always kept with, and the third generation of a family carries forward something the first generation built on a second Saturday in April with nothing but $600 and the willingness to know what he knew and wait.